Sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who never speak a single word. In a world where everyone fights to be heard above the noise, where social media feeds overflow with opinions, and protests fill the streets with chants, it's easy to forget that communication goes far beyond what we say out loud. The human spirit has countless ways to express itself, and sometimes the most profound messages come from the most unexpected sources. What happens when an entire community stops in their tracks, not because of loud speeches or dramatic performances, but because of something much more subtle yet infinitely more powerful? What occurs when thousands of people suddenly realize they've been missing something important right in front of them? This is the story of how one young person changed an entire town's understanding of what it means to truly communicate, and how a simple parade became the stage for a moment that would be remembered for generations to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as vendors set up their colorful booths for the annual Riverside Community Festival. Sarah Chen had been awake since 5 in the morning, helping her parents arrange fresh flowers and handmade crafts at their family booth. The excitement in the air was almost tangible as residents prepared for what had become the town's most celebrated tradition over the past 15 years. Sarah watched the controlled chaos around her with keen eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging bright papel picado between the lampposts while Mr. Thompson tested the sound system that would announce each parade entry. Children ran between the preparation crews, their laughter mixing with the sounds of hammers and the rustling of decorations. The festival had grown from a small neighborhood gathering into an event that drew visitors from neighboring towns. At 17, Sarah had attended every single festival since she was 2 years old. She could still remember riding on her father's shoulders, reaching up to touch the low-hanging streamers. Now she stood nearly as tall as her father, her long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she worked alongside her family. But this year felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The Chen family had immigrated to Riverside when Sarah was just 6 months old. Her parents, David and Lily, had worked tirelessly to build their small florist business from nothing. They'd started by selling flowers door to door from a rusty station wagon, gradually building relationships with neighbors who appreciated their dedication and the quality of their arrangements. Now their shop, Riverside Blooms, was a cornerstone of the community, providing flowers for weddings, funerals, and everything in between. Sarah had grown up bilingual, switching effortlessly between English with her friends and Mandarin with her grandparents who visited from San Francisco every few months. She was an honor student, captain of the debate team, and volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. To most people in Riverside, she was simply David and Lily's accomplished daughter, the girl who would probably go to a prestigious college and make her parents proud. But Sarah carried something with her that few people in the community knew about. 3 years earlier, during her freshman year of high school, she had gradually begun losing her hearing. It started so subtly that even she didn't notice at first. Friends would have to repeat themselves occasionally, teachers seemed to mumble more than usual, and the television volume crept higher and higher. By the time her parents realized something was wrong and took her to see a specialist, Sarah had lost 60% of her hearing. The diagnosis was a rare genetic condition called Usher syndrome, which affects both hearing and vision. While her eyesight remained normal for now, the doctors explained that she would likely face vision challenges later in life. The hearing loss would continue to progress, though slowly. They fitted her with hearing aids that helped considerably, but they weren't perfect, especially in crowded or noisy environments. Sarah had made the decision early on not to let her hearing loss define her or limit her activities. She learned to read lips, positioning herself strategically in classrooms and social situations. She became an expert at picking up visual cues that others missed. Most importantly, she had started learning American Sign Language, initially for her own benefit but gradually realizing its broader applications. Her ASL teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was actually the sister of the woman hanging decorations that morning. Elena Rodriguez had been born deaf and had taught ASL at the community college for over 20 years. She had become not just Sarah's teacher, but a mentor and friend. Through Elena, Sarah had been introduced to the local deaf community, a vibrant group of people who gathered monthly for social events and advocacy activities. This connection had opened Sarah's eyes to something she had never considered before. Despite living in Riverside for most of her life, she had never encountered a deaf person at any community event. The festivals, town meetings, school performances, and other gatherings that brought the community together were largely inaccessible to anyone who couldn't hear. There were no interpreters, no visual announcements, and no consideration for how someone might participate if they couldn't follow audio cues. The more Sarah learned about deaf culture and accessibility, the more she realized how many people were being unintentionally excluded from the community she loved so much. It wasn't that her neighbors were unkind or unwelcoming. They simply had never been aware that there were barriers preventing some people from participating fully. As Sarah arranged white roses in a display vase, she noticed her friend Maya approaching with her younger brother Jamie. Maya had been Sarah's closest friend since elementary school, and she was one of the few people who knew about Sarah's hearing loss. Jamie was 8 years old and had been born with Down syndrome. The family had moved to Riverside specifically because of the town's reputation for inclusive education programs. "Sarah," Maya called out, waving enthusiastically. "Mom sent us over with coffee for your parents." She made way too much and thought they might need some caffeine to get through setup. Sarah smiled and accepted the thermos gratefully. Maya's mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, was a pediatrician who had become something of an unofficial community coordinator. She seemed to know everyone and had a talent for anticipating what people needed before they asked. Jamie stood quietly beside his sister, watching the festival preparations with wide eyes. He wore a bright yellow t-shirt that read Riverside Rockets, the local Little League team he played on. Sarah had always admired how naturally Jamie seemed to fit into the community. Coaches adapted their teaching methods for him. Classmates included him in games, and adults spoke to him with genuine warmth rather than the patronizing tone that many people with disabilities encountered. "Are you excited about the parade?" Sarah asked Jamie, making sure to speak clearly so he could read her lips if needed. Jamie nodded enthusiastically and began to sign his response. Sarah was surprised and delighted to realize he was using ASL. His movements were basic but clear. Yes, parade fun. Music loud, happy. Maya noticed Sarah's expression and grinned. "We've been learning sign language as a family." Jamie picked it up really quickly, and it's helped him communicate so much better. Mom thought it would be good for all of us to learn. This revelation sparked something in Sarah's mind. If Maya's family could learn ASL to better communicate with Jamie, why couldn't the broader community learn basic signs to be more inclusive? She thought about Elena Rodriguez and the deaf community members who never attended town events, not because they weren't invited, but because there was no way for them to meaningfully participate. As the morning progressed and more vendors finished their setup, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the accessibility of the festival. The parade route was clearly marked, but only with small printed signs that would be difficult to see from a distance. The announcement system was audio only. Even the schedule of events was primarily communicated through word of mouth and a few scattered paper flyers. Around 10 o'clock, the parade participants began gathering at the starting point, 2 blocks away. Sarah could see the marching band in their crisp blue uniforms, the fire department trucks polished to a brilliant shine, and various community groups preparing their floats and banners. The energy was building toward the 11 o'clock start time. Sarah's parents were busy with last-minute customers buying flowers to throw during the parade, a tradition that had developed over the years. Children selected colorful petals to toss at their favorite parade entries, while adults chose small bouquets to wave in appreciation. The Chen family always donated a portion of their festival sales to the local food bank, another tradition that made Sarah proud of their contribution to the community. As she helped bag flowers for customers, Sarah noticed Elena Rodriguez arriving with several other members of the deaf community. This was unusual, as Sarah had never seen them at previous festivals. Elena spotted Sarah and approached with a warm smile, her hands already moving in greeting. "Good morning, beautiful day for a festival," Elena signed, speaking aloud simultaneously for the benefit of Sarah's parents and other customers. "I'm so glad you came," Sarah signed back, her movements becoming more fluid and natural as she switched to her second language. "Are others from the group coming too?" "A few of us decided to try attending this year," Elena explained. "We've always felt welcome in principle, but there's never been much we could actually participate in. We thought we'd at least come see what the excitement is about." Sarah felt a mixture of joy that they had come and sadness that this was their first time attending an event that had been part of her life for so long. She introduced Elena to her parents, who greeted her warmly despite the communication barrier. David and Lily had met Elena once before during a parent-teacher conference, but their interaction had been brief and conducted primarily through Sarah as an interpreter. As 11 o'clock approached, the crowd along the parade route thickened. Families claimed spots along the sidewalk, setting up folding chairs and blankets. Children perched on parents' shoulders, and teenagers clustered in groups, pretending to be too cool for the festivities while secretly enjoying themselves. Sarah positioned herself where she could see both the parade and Elena's group. She noticed how they stood slightly apart from the main crowd, not because they were unwelcome, but because they couldn't follow the verbal cues that helped everyone else anticipate what was happening. They couldn't hear the approaching music that signaled the parade's start, or the announcements about each participating group. The first parade entry came into view right on schedule. The Riverside High School marching band led the way, their instruments glinting in the sunlight as they played the school fight song. The crowd clapped and cheered. Parents called out their children's names, and the official photographer snapped pictures for the local newspaper. Sarah watched Elena and her friends trying to follow the crowd's reactions to understand what was happening. They could see the band, of course, but they were missing the musical element that made the performance special. They clapped when others clapped, but Sarah could tell they felt somewhat removed from the experience. The parade continued with its usual mix of entries. The volunteer fire department drove slowly in their antique truck, sirens silent but lights flashing. Local business owners walked alongside floats advertising their services. The Little League teams marched in uniform, including Jamie's Riverside Rockets, who received enthusiastic cheers from the crowd. Sarah found herself viewing the parade through new eyes, considering how each element would be experienced by someone who couldn't hear. The marching band's visual choreography was impressive, but the music was clearly the main attraction. The cheerleaders' chants were energetic and fun, but their meaning was lost without the audio component. Even the fire truck, a perennial crowd favorite, seemed diminished without the traditional sound of its horn. About halfway through the parade, something unexpected happened. The Riverside Elementary School entry had prepared a special performance. 20 children ranging in age from 6 to 10 took their positions in the middle of the street. The crowd quieted in anticipation, waiting to see what they had planned. But instead of speaking or singing, the children began to move their hands and bodies in coordinated patterns. Sarah realized with amazement that they were performing a song in American Sign Language. Their teacher, Mrs. Patterson, stood to the side providing verbal narration for the hearing audience while the children signed the lyrics to This Land Is Your Land. The performance was beautiful, but Sarah noticed something that made her heart sink. While the hearing members of the crowd were charmed by the novelty of the sign language presentation, Elena and her friends were experiencing something entirely different. For the first time during the entire festival, they were full participants rather than observers. Their faces lit up with genuine delight as they followed along with the familiar song, finally able to enjoy a parade performance on equal terms with everyone else. When the children finished their performance, the crowd applauded enthusiastically. But Sarah noticed that Elena's group was also cheering in the way that deaf people often express appreciation, raising their hands above their heads and shaking them in what's called silent applause or visual cheering. It was a beautiful sight, but Sarah realized that most of the hearing audience didn't understand the significance of what they were seeing. Sarah moved quickly through the dispersing crowd, her heart pounding with nervous energy and determination. She needed to find the festival organizers and convince them to let her make an unscheduled announcement. The main stage area was bustling with activity as the next phase of the festival began. Local bands were setting up equipment, food vendors were experiencing their first rush of customers, and children were already begging their parents for tickets to the carnival games. The festival's coordinator, Mrs. Henderson, was easy to spot in her bright red volunteer t-shirt and clipboard. She had been organizing community events in Riverside for over a decade, and Sarah knew her as someone who was well-meaning but sometimes resistant to last-minute changes that might disrupt her carefully planned schedule. "Mrs. Sally is not Henderson," Sarah called out, approaching the busy coordinator. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have an important request about making an announcement." Mrs. Henderson looked up from her clipboard with a slightly frazzled expression.
"Oh, hello, Sarah."
"I'm really swamped right now getting the afternoon activities started. What did you need?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she had to make her case quickly and convincingly. "I want to make a brief announcement to the crowd about accessibility and inclusion in our community. It will only take a few minutes, but I think it could make a real difference." "Accessibility?" Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "Dear, we always try to make sure the festival is family-friendly. Is there a safety issue I need to know about?" Henderson, like many people, didn't fully understand what accessibility meant in terms of including people with disabilities. She needed to explain her idea more clearly without taking up too much of the coordinator's time. "There are members of our community who have never been able to fully participate in our festival because of communication barriers," Sarah explained. "I've learned American Sign Language, and I want to demonstrate how simple it would be to make our events more inclusive for everyone." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, but she still looked uncertain. "That's very thoughtful of you, Sarah, but we have a full schedule of entertainment planned. The Johnson Family Bluegrass Band goes on in 15 minutes. And then we have the pie eating contest, please. Sarah interrupted gently, just 5 minutes before the band starts. I promise it will be brief, and I think people will appreciate learning something new. Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, Maya appeared at Sarah's side with Jamie in tow. What's going on? You looked really determined when you walked away from your parents' booth. Sarah quickly explained her idea to Maya, who immediately understood the significance of what her friend wanted to accomplish. Maya had grown up with Jamie and had first-hand experience with how much richer family life became when everyone could communicate effectively. Mrs. Henderson, Maya said, stepping forward with the confidence that came from being the daughter of one of the town's most respected doctors. This is really important. Jamie and I have been learning sign language as a family, and it's made such a difference for us. I think the whole community could benefit from learning some basic signs. Jamie, picking up on the conversation, began signing enthusiastically. His movements were accompanied by excited expressions that didn't require translation. Mrs. Henderson watched him with growing interest, clearly touched by his enthusiasm even though she couldn't understand his specific words.
What is he saying? Mrs.
Henderson asked. Sarah translated Jamie's signs. He's saying that he wants to help teach people. He thinks it would be fun if everyone could talk with their hands. The sincerity in Jamie's expression seemed to tip the scales for Mrs. Henderson. She looked at her clipboard, then back at the three young people in front of her. All right, she said finally. 5 minutes before the bluegrass band. But you'll need to keep it brief and appropriate for all ages. Sarah felt a surge of excitement and terror in equal measure. She had asked for the opportunity, but now she had to deliver something meaningful in just a few minutes. She thanked Mrs. Henderson and quickly began mentally organizing her thoughts. What exactly are you planning to do? Maya asked as they walked toward the stage area. I'm not entirely sure yet, Sarah admitted. But I know I want to show people how sign language works and help them understand that there are community members who have been left out of events like this. I just hope I can explain it in a way that makes sense. As they approached the stage, Sarah noticed that Elena and her friends were browsing the craft booths on the far side of the festival grounds. She excused herself from Maya and Jamie and hurried over to find Elena. Elena, Sarah signed as she approached. I have a favor to ask. Would you and your friends be willing to help me with something? Elena looked curious as Sarah quickly explained what she was planning. The older woman's expression grew more serious as she understood the scope of what Sarah wanted to accomplish. Are you sure about this? Elena signed. It's wonderful that you want to educate people, but public speaking can be unpredictable. Some people might not be receptive to the message. Sarah nodded, understanding Elena's concern. I know it's a risk, but I feel like this is the right moment. The community is all gathered together in a good mood, and after seeing the elementary school performance, people already have sign language on their minds. Elena consulted with her three friends, their hands moving in rapid conversation. Sarah could follow most of it, but they were discussing nuances and concerns that stretched her ASL vocabulary. Finally, Elena turned back to her. We'll help, she signed with a warm smile. This kind of advocacy is exactly what our community needs. What would you like us to do? Sarah felt a wave of gratitude and relief. Having Elena's support gave her confidence that she was doing the right thing. They quickly discussed the basics of what Sarah planned to say and how the deaf community members could participate. With 10 minutes until her allotted time, Sarah returned to the stage area where a small crowd was beginning to gather for the afternoon entertainment. Maya and Jamie had saved her a spot near the front, and her parents had closed their booth temporarily to come listen. Mrs. Henderson approached the microphone to make the announcement. Before we begin our afternoon entertainment, one of our local young people has asked to share something with the community. Please welcome Sarah Chen. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she climbed the steps to the small stage. Looking out over the crowd, she could see familiar faces mixed with visitors from other towns. Some people were paying attention, while others were still chatting or dealing with restless children. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. Thank you everyone for coming to our annual festival, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly over the sound system. I've been attending this celebration since I was a baby, and it's always been one of my favorite days of the year. But today I want to share something with you that I've recently learned about our community. The crowd was settling down and giving her their attention. Sarah could see her parents looking proud but slightly puzzled about what she was planning to say. 3 years ago, I began losing my hearing due to a genetic condition. Sarah continued. It happened gradually, and I've learned to adapt using hearing aids and lip reading. But more importantly, I've learned American Sign Language, which has opened up a whole new world for me. A murmur went through the crowd as people absorbed this personal information that most of them had never known. Sarah could see surprise on many faces, including those of her classmates and neighbors who had never suspected her hearing loss. Through learning ASL, I've met members of our community who have never been able to fully participate in events like this festival, Sarah continued. Not because they weren't welcome, but because there were no accommodations for people who communicate differently than most of us.
Sarah gestured toward Elena and her friends who had positioned themselves where the crowd could see them. I'd like you to meet Elena Rodriguez, who teaches ASL at the community college, and several other deaf community members who decided to attend the festival for the first time today.
Elena waved to the crowd, and her friends followed suit. Sarah could see people turning to look at them with new awareness and interest.
I want to show you how beautiful and expressive sign language can be, Sarah said. And I hope that by learning just a few simple signs today, we can start making our community events more inclusive for everyone. Sarah raised her hands and began to sign while speaking aloud. This is how you sign hello, she demonstrated, moving her hand in the familiar wave-like gesture. And this is thank you, she continued, showing the sign that involved touching her chin and moving her hand forward. Would you like to try it with me? Sarah asked the crowd. To her delight, many people raised their hands and attempted to copy her movements. Children were particularly enthusiastic, and she could see parents helping younger kids form the signs correctly. Now I want to show you something really special. My friend Jamie is going to help me demonstrate how sign language can express emotions and ideas in ways that spoken language sometimes can't. Jamie bounded up onto the stage with the fearless enthusiasm that Sarah had always admired. He positioned himself next to Sarah and looked out at the crowd with a huge smile. Jamie is going to sign a message, and I want you to see if you can understand what he's saying just by watching his expression and body language. Sarah explained. Jamie began to sign, his movements deliberate and expressive. His face lit up with joy as he communicated his message using his whole body to convey meaning. Even people who had never seen sign language before could tell that he was expressing something positive and heartfelt. Could anyone guess what Jamie was saying? Sarah asked. Several hands went up in the crowd. He looks happy, called out one child. He likes being here, suggested another voice. Sarah smiled and nodded. Jamie was saying, I love this community. Everyone here is my friend. Thank you for including me. She repeated the signs so people could see how Jamie's message had been conveyed. The crowd responded with warm applause, and Sarah could see that people were genuinely moved by Jamie's sincerity and the beauty of his signed message. Now I want to challenge all of us to think about inclusion differently, Sarah continued, feeling more confident as she saw the positive response from the community. Inclusion isn't just about being polite or welcoming. It's about making sure everyone can actually participate. Elena approached the stage and Sarah helped her up to the microphone. Elena has something to share with you, Sarah said, then stepped aside to interpret. Elena began signing and Sarah provided voice interpretation. Elena is saying that the deaf community has always felt welcome in Riverside in principle, but that today is the first time she and her friends have attended a community event because it's the first time they could truly understand what was happening.
Elena continued and Sarah interpreted. She wants you to know that sign language is not just a tool for deaf people. It's a rich, complete language that can benefit everyone.
Families with young children often use baby signs before children can speak. People in noisy environments can communicate silently. And learning any second language makes our brains stronger and more flexible. Sarah could see that the crowd was engaged and thoughtful. This was going better than she had dared to hope.
Elena is going to teach you one more sign, Sarah interpreted as Elena demonstrated.
This is the sign for community. You make a C shape with both hands, and then bring them together in a circle. It represents how we all connect to form something larger than ourselves. The crowd attempted the sign, and Sarah felt a powerful moment of connection as hundreds of people simultaneously created the visual symbol for unity and togetherness. I have one final request, Sarah said as Elena stepped back. The next time our community holds an event, whether it's a festival, a town meeting, or a school performance, I hope you'll ask yourselves, how can we make sure everyone can participate? Sometimes the answer might be providing an interpreter, or visual announcements, or just learning a few basic signs. Sarah paused, looking out at the attentive crowd. But most importantly, I hope you'll remember that differences in how we communicate don't have to be barriers. They can be opportunities to learn from each other and build a stronger, more connected community. The crowd erupted in applause, including the silent applause that Elena's group provided by raising their hands above their heads. Sarah felt overwhelmed with emotion as she saw the positive response from her neighbors and friends. As she prepared to leave the stage, Sarah realized that something significant had shifted in that moment. She had opened a conversation that the community hadn't known it needed to have. The question now was, what would happen next? And whether this moment of awareness would translate into lasting change. Mrs. Nine. Henderson approached the microphone as Sarah stepped down from the stage. Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation. I think we all learned something important today. She paused, looking thoughtful. In fact, I'm wondering if we should consider making accessibility a regular part of our event planning going forward. Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Mrs. Henderson was already thinking about future improvements, then her message had truly been heard and understood. As she rejoined Maya and Jamie in the crowd, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning of something much larger than a 5-minute presentation at a festival. The bluegrass band was setting up their instruments on stage, but the energy in the crowd had changed. People were still talking about what they had just experienced, practicing the signs Sarah had taught them, and some were approaching Elena's group to attempt basic communication. Sarah watched as her community took its first steps toward becoming more inclusive, and she knew that the real work was just beginning. As the last parade entries passed by, and the crowd began to disperse toward the various festival activities, Sarah found herself filled with an overwhelming sense of purpose. She had watched her community celebrate together while unknowingly excluding members who wanted nothing more than to be part of the joy and tradition. The seed of an idea that had been forming all morning suddenly crystallized into a clear vision. Sarah knew exactly what she needed to do, and she knew it had to happen today while the community was gathered together and in a celebratory mood. The annual Riverside Festival was about to become something much more significant than anyone had planned. Sarah began moving through the crowd with new determination, her mind already working through the logistics of what she was about to attempt. She had no idea if it would work, but she knew she had to try. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to show her community what they had been missing and how much richer their celebration could be when everyone was truly included. The weeks following the festival brought changes to Riverside that Sarah had never anticipated. What had started as a spontaneous 5-minute presentation had sparked conversations throughout the community that continued long after the festival booths were packed away and the streets were cleaned. The first sign that something significant had shifted came 3 days after the festival when Dr. Patricia Williams called Sarah's house. Maya's mother had been thinking about the presentation and wanted to discuss the possibility of offering basic ASL classes at the community center. As a pediatrician, Dr. Williams had encountered many families who could benefit from sign language, not just those with deaf family members but also children with autism, speech delays, or other communication challenges. I've been researching the benefits of sign language for typically developing children too, Dr. Petson Williams explained to Sarah and her parents during a meeting at their kitchen table. Studies show that babies who learn basic signs can communicate their needs earlier, which reduces frustration for both children and parents. And learning any second language, especially one that's visual and physical like ASL, can enhance cognitive development. Sarah felt excited but also somewhat overwhelmed by the enthusiasm her presentation had generated. She had hoped to raise awareness, but she hadn't expected to become the focal point of a community-wide initiative. Would you be interested in helping develop a curriculum?
Dr. Jen Lopes,
Williams continued. Elena Rodriguez has already agreed to be the primary instructor, but she suggested that having a young person involved might help attract families with children and teenagers. Sarah looked at her parents, who nodded encouragingly.
David and Lily had been quietly proud of their daughter's advocacy, though they had also been surprised by her willingness to publicly share information about her hearing loss.
In their culture, personal challenges were often kept private, but they could see how much Sarah's openness had meant to the community. I'd love to help, Sarah replied, but I want to make sure we do this right. It shouldn't just be about teaching signs as a novelty. People need to understand deaf culture and the importance of accessibility. Dr. Williams smiled. That's exactly what Elena said you would say. She told me that you have a mature understanding of these issues that goes beyond just wanting to help. Over the following week, Sarah found herself juggling her regular school responsibilities with an increasing number of requests related to the ASL initiative. Mrs. Henderson had called to ask if Sarah would be willing to consult on making future community events more accessible. The high school principal wanted to discuss the possibility of offering ASL as a foreign language option. Even the local newspaper wanted to write a feature article about her advocacy efforts. The attention was flattering, but Sarah began to feel the weight of being seen as the spokesperson for accessibility issues. She was still learning herself, and she worried about being thrust into a role she wasn't prepared for. It was Elena who helped her put these concerns into perspective. Advocacy isn't about being an expert, Elena explained during one of their regular ASL practice sessions. It's about being willing to start conversations and keep learning along the way. You don't have to have all the answers, but you've shown that you're willing to ask the right questions.
Elena had become more than just Sarah's teacher. She had become a mentor and friend who understood the complexities of navigating between hearing and deaf worlds. She helped Sarah understand that her unique perspective as someone who was losing her hearing gave her insights that could benefit both communities.
The most effective advocates are often people who can bridge different experiences, Elena continued. You understand what it's like to be hearing, and you're learning what it's like to lose hearing.
That gives you a perspective that purely hearing or purely deaf advocates might not have.
As the community center ASL classes took shape, Sarah discovered that the interest extended far beyond what anyone had expected.
The initial plan had been to offer one beginner class for families with young children. Instead, they found themselves planning 3 different levels of classes to accommodate the demand from various age groups and learning goals. Maya and Jamie enrolled in the beginner class along with their parents. Several teachers from the elementary school signed up for the intermediate class, hoping to better serve students with communication challenges. Even some local business owners expressed interest in learning basic signs to better serve customers who might be deaf or hard of hearing. Sarah found herself working closely with Elena to develop materials that went beyond basic sign vocabulary. They created cultural education components that helped hearing people understand deaf perspectives on communication, community, and identity. They also addressed practical topics like how to get someone's attention respectfully, basic etiquette for interacting with deaf people, and the importance of maintaining eye contact during signed conversations. One of the most meaningful developments came from an unexpected source. Patterson, the elementary school teacher who had organized the ASL performance for the festival parade, approached Sarah with an ambitious idea. She wanted to create an ongoing partnership between her students and members of the deaf community. The children were so excited about learning those signs for the parade, Mrs. Patterson explained. But I realized that we were treating sign language like a performance rather than a real communication tool. I'd like to change that. The partnership that emerged was beautiful in its simplicity. Elena and several other deaf community members began visiting Mrs. Akia Patterson's classroom regularly, not as teachers but as conversation partners. The children practiced their developing ASL skills in real interactions, while the deaf visitors got to connect with young people who approached them with curiosity rather than pity or fear. Sarah often joined these classroom visits, serving as an interpreter when needed, but also as a role model for the children. Seeing someone their age who was successfully navigating hearing loss helped normalize the experience of disability for the students.
Several children mentioned that they had grandparents or other family members with hearing loss, and Sarah's example gave them ideas for better communication with their loved ones. The impact of these initiatives extended beyond the immediate participants.
Other teachers began incorporating visual elements into their lessons, not just for deaf students, but recognizing that many children learn better when information is presented in multiple formats. The school's morning announcements began including a visual component displayed on screens throughout the building. The annual school talent show added an ASL interpretation track for the first time. As autumn progressed, Sarah noticed changes in her own experience of the community. People she had known for years began greeting her with basic signs they had learned. Store employees made more effort to face her when speaking, having learned about the importance of lip reading. Even small gestures like these made her daily interactions more comfortable and inclusive. But perhaps the most significant change was in her relationship with her own hearing loss. For 3 years, Sarah had focused on adapting to her condition and minimizing its impact on her life. Through her advocacy work, she began to see her hearing loss not as a limitation to overcome, but as a part of her identity that connected her to a rich cultural community. This shift in perspective became clear during the planning for the next year's festival. Mrs. Bod Henderson had created an accessibility committee and asked Sarah to chair it. As they discussed potential improvements, Sarah found herself thinking not just about accommodating people with disabilities, but about how universal design principles could make the event better for everyone. What if we provided visual schedules for all festival activities? Sarah suggested during one committee meeting. That would help deaf attendees, but it would also help families with small children, people who don't speak English as their first language, and anyone who prefers visual information. And real-time captioning for the stage presentations could benefit people with hearing aids who struggle in noisy environments, elderly attendees who might have mild hearing loss, and even people who just want to follow along more easily, added Dr. Williams.
The committee's discussions revealed how accessibility improvements often benefited far more people than initially intended. Ramps helped wheelchair users, but also parents with strollers and delivery workers with heavy equipment.
Clear signage assisted visually impaired attendees, but also helped anyone navigating an unfamiliar event layout. As winter approached, the ASL classes at the community center had evolved into something more than anyone had originally envisioned. They had become a hub for ongoing conversations about inclusion, accessibility, and community building. The classes attracted not only people learning sign language, but also individuals interested in broader discussions about how to make Riverside more welcoming for residents with various disabilities. Sarah found herself facilitating some of these discussions, drawing on her growing knowledge and her connections with disability advocacy organizations in the region. She had connected with other young advocates through social media and had attended several conferences focused on youth leadership and disability rights. These experiences had broadened Sarah's understanding of accessibility issues, beyond just hearing loss. She learned about the challenges faced by people with mobility disabilities, visual impairments, cognitive differences, and mental health conditions. Each conversation expanded her vision of what an inclusive community could look like. The most profound moment of growth came during a visit from Sarah's grandparents in December. Her grandmother had been gradually losing her vision due to macular degeneration, a fact that the family had discussed in practical terms but never really processed emotionally. During their visit, Sarah's grandmother expressed frustration about no longer being able to participate in many of the activities she had enjoyed, from reading to crafting to following along with television programs. Sarah realized that her advocacy work had equipped her with knowledge and resources that could help her own family. Together, they researched adaptive technologies and techniques that could help her grandmother maintain her independence and continue pursuing her interests. They connected with the local chapter of the National Federation of the Blind, which provided both practical resources and social connections. "You know," her grandmother said during one of their conversations, "I never thought about disability as something that could bring people together rather than isolate them. Watching what you've done in your community gives me hope that there are ways to stay connected even when your body changes." This conversation helped Sarah understand that her advocacy work wasn't just about helping others. It was about building a community that would support all of them as they aged and faced their own physical and cognitive changes. Universal design and inclusive practices weren't charity for a separate group of disabled people. They were investments in everyone's future quality of life. As the one-year anniversary of her festival presentation approached, Sarah reflected on how much her community had changed. The next festival would include ASL interpretation for all stage presentations, visual announcements, accessible pathways throughout the event area, and quiet spaces for people who might be overwhelmed by crowds and noise. More importantly, the changes had gone beyond event logistics to create lasting shifts in how people thought about inclusion and community membership. The ASL classes had created new friendships across traditional social boundaries. Local businesses had begun considering accessibility in their customer service training. The school district had adopted more inclusive communication practices across all their programs. Sarah had also changed in ways she was still discovering. She had found her voice as an advocate, developed leadership skills she didn't know she possessed, and built connections with communities she had never known existed. Her hearing loss, which had initially seemed like a personal challenge to overcome, had become a bridge that connected her to broader movements for social justice and inclusion. As she looked toward graduation and college applications, Sarah knew that accessibility advocacy would continue to be an important part of her life. But she also understood that the most meaningful changes happened through the daily interactions and small choices that built community one relationship at a time. The girl who had spoken without words at the festival had discovered that communication comes in many forms, and that the most powerful messages are often the ones that invite others to join in creating something better together. In teaching her community to see and include people who had been invisible, Sarah had helped create a model of what inclusive community could look like when everyone was valued for their unique contributions. The parade had indeed halted unexpectedly that day, not just for a few minutes during Sarah's presentation, but in a much deeper sense as an entire community paused to reconsider how they could better serve all their members. In that moment of stillness, they had discovered new ways to move forward together.